Hello and good morning. My name is Charles Lavery. I'm a lead developer working on B2C commerce at Salesforce. Unfortunately, Oleg could not make it today, but today I'll be talking about DevOps practices with B2C commerce. Now, unfortunately, this is a topic full of opinions, and since we're short on time, I can't touch everything in DevOps, so what I want to talk about some general recommendations in a few key areas, things I found work well for SIs, technology partners, and merchant teams. And then I want to talk about some specific tools designed for B2C that you can use to improve your process. But first, as always, please make your purchasing technology decisions on the product as it exists today and not on forward-looking statements. So let's start with a little real fake story. So imagine a release process when you have to give the operations team notice 30 days in advance of a release with a zip archive of the full solution, together with a big Word document containing screenshots and indicators explaining every step that is required to be done in Business Manager. So you prepare your release, and it will, or may not, go into release in 30 days, as the operations team also needs to prepare manually by merging from other teams changes that should go into production. Well, we faced these kind of scenarios with low-performing teams before. They would create multiple versions of the same cartridge by prefixing it with a version prefix. They maintained upwards of 80 cartridges on the same realm for just a few sites. The operations team would require you to specify with guiding screenshots exact steps on how to navigate to the specific module where configuration is required and what exactly to change, and all of this with your team having zero access to inspect the progress. And that's not even mentioning how the merchandising team had to use separate instances for their configurations and manually migrate them one by one during release window when no one else can use staging for any kind of updates. So hopefully this sounds like a nightmare scenario, but these are processes that exist today on this platform. So first, what do we mean by DevOps? Well, for us, DevOps is the combination of philosophies, practices, and tools that increase an organization's ability to deliver applications and services at high velocity, evolving and improving products at a faster pace than organizations using a more traditional software development and infrastructure management process. This speed enables organizations to better serve their customers and compete more effectively in the market. So the term DevOps is a combination of the words development and operations, and that really reflects the process of integrating these disciplines into one continuous process across teams. So DevOps is an ongoing evolution. It's a learning path that, from our experience, doesn't have a formal destination. And there are ways to achieve success faster. Where do we start is one of the challenges in DevOps adoption. So our recommendation is start where the pain is most acute and visible, which is typically deployments, the boundary between dev and ops. You're not going to magically fix your organization's culture overnight, but you can start by improving collaboration and results across that one functional boundary. We're really placing organizations into one of 5 stages of DevOps adoption. Stage 1 is no adoption at all, and it's a low-performing environment where teams are separated. There's no or low usage of version control sometimes. Releases are complex with siloed teams, poor or no documentation, and missing processes. There are high rates of regression and bugs. The error logs continue to grow until they're often don't turn over anymore. There's still some kind of build process and deployment flows because code must be delivered somehow, but most of those activities are manual and only a small group of people govern that knowledge. Stage 2 is the beginning of a change in mindset focused on agility and development and initial automation and operations with an emphasis on collaboration between teams. It's where we build tool awareness and set up collaboration frameworks and a shift left in quality assurance. Stage 3 is an organization-wide transformation that begins with defined processes and established communication and automation. It's a time when your organization follows a concrete version control workflow and applies automation in their testing and deployments. Codified builds and release processes can be run by any individual in the organization with the appropriate authorization. And stage 4 is a phase when the organization applies measurements and metrics to their processes. You want to analyze the number of deployments, how much time they take, and the changes they bring, good or bad. Monitoring log activity for errors to catch regressions, service interruptions, and triggered events. Setting up operational KPIs such as error rates, failed orders, service failures, job executions, etc. And stage 5 doesn't have an end, as DevOps is a journey, and it's a time where you kind of continue to evolve. So what does the previously mentioned low-performing team need first? Well, first they need a version control system. That's an obvious one. You'd be surprised how many don't actually have this. That's an easy one to pick because there's so many great options out there. Next, they need to choose how they're going to do continuous integration and deployment. They need a system to do that. I have a few recommendations there. One, you want to choose a system that integrates well with existing IT systems. So for instance, an otherwise heavy Azure shop may choose to use Azure pipelines. But if you're not using Azure, that would be a bad choice. So integration of existing systems can be important. The proximity to version control. Your CI will be tightly integrated into version control, and if it's not, that's not great. So choose one that makes that easy. Other things that might be important are things like notifications and alerting with Slack, support for storage backends. Like, for instance, your team might want to store artifacts of your CI pipelines or tests in S3. So choosing a CI that makes that easy is a good choice. Finally, and I think this is really, to me, one of the most important things, is the developer experience. Taking care to improve here will lead to benefits downstream. Some practices I recommend for developer experience is, as much as possible, ensure that developers can use their own IDE of choice, but at the same time, the team should adopt a golden path for onboarding new team members. For instance, I'm a JetBrains user, but on all my B2C projects, I specifically ensure that VS Code maintains the path of least resistance for onboarding, so documentations, default configurations, screenshots, plugins, etc. use that golden path. And in a later slide, I'll show how we can help onboard using VS Code itself. Your project should have a minimum of setup steps for a developer to start working. Common pitfalls should be automated and avoided with sensible defaults and combined scripts. We'll look at some tools to simplify that. And finally, I recommend taking a cautious approach to certain tooling. So things like code linting rules should be groomed for items that improve code legibility and catch common bugs. Too many times I see teams adopt just a massive linting rule set, and then they get frustrated to the point where it becomes a bike shedding exercise, and eventually they abandon it altogether, even though it's still in the project. They eventually remove it from their CI, it's no longer used, and the code submits to code rot. For environments, there's so many ways we can talk about environments. Here a team is using on-demand sandboxes for 4 developers. Each of them has at least one dedicated sandbox. There's a sandbox that's allocated for continuous integration and delivery. On-request instances can be provisioned for snapshots, proof of concepts, and testing individual features. For this organization, development is used for UAT and systems integration testing. That's pretty common. While staging is for pre-prod merchandising by the business team and final accepted deployment. It's important regardless to set up and understand how your integration environments are going to work. Which are the development environments, which are for systems integration and user acceptance testing, which environments are easily disposable and ephemeral. For example, environments used by developers, proof of concepts and testing should be able to be provisioned and destroyed in a matter of minutes. If you can't do that, recommend using tooling to improve that. You need to document these environments and how they're going to be used by everyone in the organization so everybody knows what's going on and what they should expect. Another thing I think is a good thing is that for a team to adopt a version control workflow that's going to work for them and every stakeholder in the release process. And what I mean by that is that the workflow should map to and complement existing acceptance processes rather than antagonize them. For instance, a slower, more methodical acceptance process, your merchandising team just does not have the time to accept new features, and frequently releases are delayed. For something like that, you might have multiple active releases at one time. Now, you won't have more than one on production, but you'll have your current production release, which needs maintenance, and you'll have the next release, which may be at various stages of readiness. So your version control workflow should be able to support those multiple releases. So a process might benefit from a more traditional box software approach like Git flow with release branches, maintenance branches, etc. However, if you're a faster-paced team where releases can move quickly through user acceptance and testing, they may not think of that box software approach as very useful, and they may choose a simpler workflow like GitHub Flow. So you're going to want to document and perform how those actions can be repeated by every team in the same way. For example, if and how a bug fix or feature branch is performed, how do you name it? Do you rebase, merge commit, and squash merge? How does a hotfix get to production? These are things that should be done the same way every time, and developers should be able to quickly reference or be guided through how to do it. And finally, I recommend using immutable tags to mark the sources of releases. Too many times it's hard to actually trace back through the build process to exactly what source code commit actually produced the released artifacts. So there's so much more I can talk about process-wise, and those are just a handful of recommendations. But I think with limited time, I'd like to go through like a tooling showcase. Now, you don't have to catch the links or QR codes here, as I'll be posting these slides as well as a community repo with all the links to here. So links to that will be at the end. So first, there's SFCCI. Now, this is the primary tools most teams should be using to automate the most common tasks in their DevOps processes. Things like code deployment and code version management, system job execution and monitoring, custom job execution, things like externally triggering replications. Many teams want to do that, or search indexing. Management of on-demand sandboxes obviously is very useful with that, and many more things. It's too much to list for SFCCI, but this should be a key tool in your automation scripts. Instance Initializer isn't really even a tool in itself, but it's a great example of using SFCCI in practice and combining it to launch an initializer sandbox with SFRA in a server-to-server scenario, that is a headless scenario, like continuous integration. Using it as a reference to how to apply SFCCI to your own processes and adapt it to your own project. So it's a great little showcase to repository. And here's something I alluded to in previous slides. So I think it's critically important for DevOps practice to educate and encourage developer involvement in how things work. Too many times a developer can't actually explain how a particular build is done or how things are deployed, et cetera. And also, you need to continuously improve the way devs are onboarding. With so much turnover these days, people moving jobs all the time, onboarding is more important than ever. So Code Tours is a Visual Studio Code extension that I use to onboard developers for my project. It allows you to create a markdown-based slides right in the editor that can be tied to code files, individual lines in those files, and sections of the editor like the terminal window, the sidebar, or other custom modules. And you can do things like launch any actual command in VS Code through links in the markdown. So I use this to I have tours to walk my developers through the basics, such as setting up their B2C sandbox, building, testing, and pushing code. But we also use it to step through key areas of the code base and the underlying tooling itself, guiding them, but also providing a reference to call back right in their IDE if they forget something. So this learning by doing can be much more effective than plain documentation. For example, a team might want to use a code tour for performing common actions in version control, like how do you do a hotfix branch? Like, let's do that right in the editor, where actual links can do things like launch a terminal, execute commands, execute npm run scripts, etc., or VS Code tasks. Or maybe a tour through a complex service implementation that is, was such a pain for a developer, and the lead developer left years ago. You want to have that documented for future maintainers. Well, what's better than actually documenting the code itself through slides rather than some separate documentation? For large merchants, using an XML reducer can be critical to getting production data back into developer and testing instances. This is especially important when you have large SKU counts, 100,000 or even just about 10,000. Catalog Reducer is a cartridge that'll export a reduced version of your production catalog on staging, and this can be done on schedule or on demand via jobs. And there are related community tools like for taking that reduced catalog and producing a derived product and inventory XML. So you combine these things with, for instance, SFCCI to trigger the jobs, download the reduced catalog, script the price book and inventory generation, and you're left with artifacts that can be delivered to your sandboxes. So, for instance, you can then automatically deploy that to your continuous integration environment so that it's constantly running with at least somewhat of a semi-real production catalog. And then make the files available on the shared web dev location for your ODS realm, which normally doesn't share a web dev location with your production instance group, but then your developers will have that archive to import at their leisure. B2C Tools is a tool in library to manage instance imports and data manipulation scripts and automatically apply them to instances as part of both a developer workflow and deployment automation. I call these imports and scripts migrations because they're similar in nature to SQL data migrations. At runtime, the tool automatically bootstraps itself on the instance and installs metadata for itself to work. And then it runs the imports and scripts stored in the project's code base. It does this independently by default by tracking in the instance what it applied previously. So in this way, an instance can be migrated from its current state to the state directed by the code base. So teams can use this to define a data strategy for managing data and metadata in code across all their projects. And since it's extensible and it offers many different approaches to apply the data, such as always run imports, run once migrations, run only on certain instance type. You might have things you never want to run on staging or based on some other kind of complex criteria. It allows you to extend that with JavaScript code. So teams can localize their metadata changes with their code changes, open up a number of benefits. So these changes can be treated in pull request and code review with the same diligence that code can be treated. They're there localized with the actual features that use them. And to ensure that metadata is appropriate for that feature. And with the metadata in code, teams can see and inspect all the changes and operations that will be run against UAT and their staging environments at the release time. So you can see at once exactly what will be applied, and it gives you more confidence in your release process. And since this tool is very instance-focused, it has multi-instance management that's compatible with VS Code and JetBrains' popular IDE extensions, and a number of other features like page designer export. S4A Webpack Builder is a great project for S4A-based projects to simplify the building of both S4A, its plugins, and your custom code, while moving it forward by adding more modern sort of bundler features like Webpack loaders, additional Webpack loaders, live reload, more. This really helps simplify the developer experience, removing pitfalls and simplifying the build process. Teams that want to use JSX with React in their S4A projects use TypeScript, Transpile with modern Babel stack. The team for this project recently added live reload functionality as well. So this also helps teams who need a more flexible project setup for front-end development, as the reference architecture approach can often be restricting. So a lot of tools I just talked about. I'm actually going to be combining these into a single sort of DevOps kitchen sink sample repo to provide a reference point for use of these tools in practice, as well as other DevOps best practice for the community to contribute to. So I kind of want to have the community to have a repo where they can kind of go and either reference or contribute back to kind of canonical practices that we've seen around SIs and partners and merchants. So we'll be using GitHub Actions as our CI to deploy the product to a real instance to be more than just a proof of concept. And we'll have the aforementioned code tours to walk through how the project is set up and how the project works. In addition to that, I'm adding a Docker-based DevOps dashboard into the repo itself to showcase how teams can use open source tools to monitor and alert on their B2C instance off-platform. Things like using Elasticsearch, Logstash, and Kibana to process B2C logs offline, and using Grafana to alert on those logs and other metrics like, for instance, order failures, service failures, job failures, etc. So all the tools I previously mentioned will be linked from there, as well as a copy of these slides. And this should be open to the community by next Monday. So if you don't see it by then, feel free to pester me on the unofficial Slack. Speaking of that, where can I find more info? Well, you've got the official sources, including the newly released Commerce Developer Center and the B2C Commerce Info Center, of course. But the community is a great resource. So you've got the new B2C Commerce DevOps or Developers Trailblazer community and the very active unofficial Slack. And there is a link for the community page on the Developer Center, and you can Google that as well. And like I said, I will be posting these slides to that GitHub repo and on the unofficial developer Slack.